We actually only hold these kinds of events from time to time, and we do so when we feel there's someone whose work and effort we feel is truly noteworthy and worthy of celebrating. As I mentioned earlier, we believe that Bob Galvin fits this criteria to a T. He's labored for decades as a technology pioneer, an entrepreneur, and much more on a global basis. And we're particularly pleased to have the opportunity to recognize actually just some of his achievements. Joining Bob this evening is another entrepreneur who is quite early demonstrating many of the same characteristics. A businessman, a scholar, firmly rooted in principles, who's making major waves in quite a number of fields. Our first speaker tonight is Peter Thiel, who's founder and managing member of Clarium Capital Management, a global macro hedge fund. The fund has been profiled in Barron's, the Financial Times, an institutional investor, and Peter's commentary on the markets is regularly featured on programs like Kudlow and Kramer, Your World with Neil Cavuto. Although still shy of 40, in fact well shy of 40, Peter has already had a deep and varied career in finance, including derivatives trading for Credit Suisse financial products in New York and London, and securities law practice at Sullivan & Cromwell, one of New York's most prominent business law firms. But Peter is perhaps best known for co-founding PayPal in 1997. Within just a few years, he established PayPal as the world's preeminent electronic payment services provider and distinguished PayPal as one of the few internet firms to achieve profitability, selling it to eBay in 2002 for $1.5 billion. Peter received his BS and JD from Stanford University and sits on the board of visitors of the Stanford Law School, as well as on the board of directors of the Independent Institute. I first had the pleasure of working closely with Peter when he co-authored the Independent Institute's book critiquing political correctness in higher education, entitled The Diversity Myth. He continues to apply his analytical mind to a variety of interests, and I'm very pleased to present Peter Thiel.
Thank you very much, David, for that incredibly gracious introduction. I feel like anything I say is going to be an incredible letdown after that, and I must confess that I always feel a bit intimidated being in front of a group as distinguished as all of you are who are here tonight. And one of the things that's so difficult is I'm always asked to sort of tell people lessons about things that we learned from PayPal, or lessons about being an entrepreneur or an innovator or the global marketplace. It's actually very difficult to abstract. You know, the reality is that each of these companies are very unique. You can't actually necessarily apply that much from them. So I'm going to say a few things that are a little bit more general in nature. I thought it would be helpful maybe just to start by telling the particular story of PayPal, how we built the company, how we started it. You know, we may have been brilliant, we may have been very lucky. Perhaps it was a combination of the two. The company was started, as David mentioned, in the late 90s by myself and another friend of mine. We recruited a number of our college friends at the point where I was the only person of the founding team who was over 23 years old. Everybody else basically was not aware of things that they weren't allowed to do or couldn't do, and so we set out to basically create a new world currency, or as we more modestly like to describe it, a financial operating system for the world. And for those of you, some of you may be familiar with the PayPal product, some of you may not be. The basic idea was to link money and email. And it was a very simple idea. It was basically you could send money to anybody with an email address. And it seemed like a pure product that was designed for the pure internet world of 1999. Money is the ultimate virtual product. You don't need to have a storefront or anything like that. All you needed were some great web designers, some top-notch engineers. You needed to get a website up, and then people could start sending money from one person to the next anywhere in the world. We concluded that because we weren't old enough, nobody else would take us seriously. So we had to figure out a way to launch the product without working with big companies, without working with banks or telephone operators or anything like that. And so we had to somehow get a grassroots adoption of the product to start. And we created what's called in the industry lingo viral product, where as people use the product, they'd get other people to use it. And it was very simple. You'd register with the product, you'd give us your credit card number, you typed in the email address of the person to whom you wish to send money, and then the recipient would get an email saying, you've got cash. And at that point, the recipient would have every incentive to sign up. And as a result, you could start with a small number of people, and you could gradually grow the product as people send money to one another for various reasons. We also concluded that just to help the process along, we'd pay people up front to get them to sign up. We'd give you $10. We give you $10 if you signed up, and we gave you $10 for everybody you referred. So it cost us $20 to acquire each customer, and while it felt like an insane thing to do, and there were all sorts of concerns about there being adverse selection, and you just were selecting for people who only wanted to get paid free money, it was actually cheaper than all the other sort of advertising type opportunities that were available. The product was launched in October of 1999. At the time, the company had 24 people. And we basically started with those people emailing money to their friends, to their acquaintances, and then it started to grow with this very smooth exponential curve where the user numbers, at first it was a very small number, but it was basically compounding at about 5 to 7% per day. And if you do the math, it grows pretty quickly. And so it was by mid-November, we were up to 1,000 people. By December 31st of 1999, it was up to 12,000. By February 2nd of 2000, it was up to 100,000. By mid-April of 2000, it was up to 1 million. It was this smooth, quasi-exponential curve. It turned out, actually, that people found it to be very useful in a lot of contexts, especially among small businesses that needed to receive payments from other people where all they knew was their email address, and it was a way for people selling people who were micro merchants, in particular on eBay, which subsequently bought the company, to buy and sell things from one another. The company, incidentally, has kept scaling and scaling. Currently, there are about 46 million people worldwide using the PayPal service. It's available in about 38 different countries. So it continued to grow and grow. But the initial stage was this pure cascading growth trajectory. And looking at it in early 2000, the thought really was, this product is going to literally take over the whole world. And we're going to replace every government in the world. We're going to replace all the finance, this is going to be the new currency. It is going to, it's growing so quickly. By the end of the year, we will have more or less taken over the whole planet. And there was a talk I gave almost exactly 4 years ago at the financial crypto conference in Anguilla, where there's sort of these libertarian and anarchist type people, and they've been trying to come up with this new digital payment, digital currency type idea that would be free from all sorts of government constraints, and they've been working on it for 7, 8 years. By early 2000, there were people giving theoretical papers on why this could never be done. And when Max, my co-founder, and I arrived and announced that we'd figured it out, there were a number of people who were not too happy, it was the goal was to actually try to build something like this, and it scaled. I would say there was unfortunately there was a transition point, sort of in the spring of 2000. We had you could say a rendezvous with reality or with politics, or with the way the world really works, but perhaps the way the world really works and really shouldn't work, or something like that. The first part, of course, was that There's some basic things at the margins that started to break down. It turned out we had customers, and you needed to do something with all these customers. And so they were calling in nonstop on the company phone lines. By April of 2000, you could not use any of the telephones in the office without. If you picked up a phone, there was a customer calling in. You had to basically use you could only use cell phones at the office. It grew far beyond anybody's expectations. It was so successful. But on a more sinister level, what we next encountered were Russian mobsters who were interested in figuring out ways to steal money. And there were all sorts of variations on this, but the standard variation was that a mobster would break into an unsecured database and steal 1,000 people's identities. So they'd steal your name, your credit card number, your social security number, all that stuff. They'd set up 1,000 different PayPal accounts in those people's names, and they'd charge each of those people, say, $500, and collect $500,000 in their account. And from there, it would get wired to the Bank of New York, and from there to Kazakhstan. And we had this long race with the Russian mob in terms of how do we stop these people. And it was one of the core technology innovations we developed in 2000 was to develop a powerful anti-fraud technology that could actually stop all this fraud from happening. And sort of a lot of rather colorful stories. I remember my mother was accosted by this guy, Igor Yagelnitzer, at a local chess club, and it took me about a year later to figure out that our anti-fraud technology, which was named Igor, was named after this person. He had threatened my mother with that if he didn't get his money out of PayPal because we'd frozen his account, he was going to report us to the police. It turned out. And then, of course, so we solved that problem. Business continued to scale very nicely. But probably the biggest challenge that we ran into as entrepreneurs was the government regulatory apparatus. And this was certainly the thing that I perhaps would have least expected. But in sort of both in a sense that it failed in anything positive that one might have expected, and then, of course, all sorts of negative things. So the positive place where it failed was in providing security. The natural thing was there are people defrauding you. You think you can go to the police. So maybe Mr. Yagelnitzer is not going to go to the police, but maybe we can go to the police and report Mr. Yagelnitzer. We proceeded to do that. The FBI showed up at his home. Concluded he was totally innocent. We'd given them web pages. They were asking us, what's a banner at? There was a jurisdictional dispute between the FBI office in San Jose and San Francisco over which of them had jurisdiction over Kazakhstan and could handle it. So there were some very serious sorts of problems. So on the positive side, if we had not come up with a technology solution to fraud, we would have simply gone out of business. They might have arrested various low-level people, but we never would have gotten the money back. On the more critical side, the kinds of issues one ran into were incredibly arcane, unworkable banking rules, rules about payment systems, rules about, as David mentioned, I'd been trained as a lawyer, and I guess I'd been ideologically fairly libertarian before starting the company. But I sort of became completely fanatical in this process. By the end of PayPal, by early 2002, we were spending about $500,000 a month in legal fees to deal with all the various regulatory pressures. The company was doing well. It made in 2002 about $200 million in revenues, $35 million in profits, but $500,000 a month. There were 20 different law firms on the payroll, and it was patent lawyers, banking lawyers, antitrust lawyers, labor lawyers, immigration lawyers. You had payments lawyers as distinct from banking lawyers, and you had various patent, intellectual property things, and so on down the line. It was a really extraordinary sort of a situation. The company. Sort of to make the long story short, the company did not end up taking over the world in quite the way we had originally envisioned. It was still, by many measures, a great success, had a very successful IPO in early 2002, and was acquired by eBay in October of 2002 for $1.5 billion, as we basically were in effect the cash registers on eBay, that about 2/3 of our volume was on eBay, and about 2/3 of the people on eBay were using PayPal. Now, I'm very happy that in the title for your talk tonight, you had nothing about the government or ways in which the government can help entrepreneurship or innovation or the global marketplace, because I do think that one of the lessons is that on every single level, I think there's never been an innovative idea the government did not like. The craziest version of this that I have to recount in the PayPal context was on the banking regulatory side. In the middle of the IPO, I'll give you the full chronology since it was so crazy. A Business Week article said, great company, but nobody knows whether they're subject to banking rules. And there are 4 states that have not decided, and there was California, New York, and Idaho, and the state of Louisiana. And there was a mid-level banking bureaucrat in Louisiana who said, I don't really know what they're doing, but if they're doing illegal banking, they have to stop. And at that point, the SEC commissioner, and we drew, unfortunately, a very short straw in picking our SEC regulator and going through the IPO process. He was scanning the internet for stories about PayPal because he had concluded that all companies in the US were run by crooks, and it was his duty to prevent all the companies from having IPOs, and he was going to stop us from doing it no matter how he could. And he basically, and so he proactively called up the people in Louisiana and said, well, are you working to shut them down? And they were intimidated by this call from someone in DC and said, yes, we'll probably do that. And a few days later, when we talked to the SEC, they announced, well, what are you doing about, have you disclosed in your document that you're being shut down in Louisiana? And we said, well, that's news to us. But he said, well, I have the facts right here. I'll send it to you. And then at that process, I basically got on the phone and tried to track down the banking commissioner in Louisiana in the middle of Mardi Gras. And I think it was one of the reasons it was one of the, perhaps this was the single most successful achievement I had at PayPal, was I managed to track the banking commissioner of Louisiana down in the middle of Mardi Gras and convince him that perhaps this was not a wise step for Louisiana and they did not want to get a reputation as a technologically backward state. But at any rate, when one steps back and thinks about stories like PayPal's story, when one thinks about the whole new economy, I think there were a lot of mistakes that were made. There were a lot of people who were naive and idealistic and who built businesses that ultimately did not succeed. I think that needs to be conceded. All of that happened. At the same time, I really believe that this was the right way to go. It was, we are headed towards a global economy. PayPal was critical towards that in terms of creating a seamless way for people to move money around the world. We're headed towards a global marketplace, and I think the only way that a global economy can ultimately work is based on free trade, the free exchange of different people, and so on down the line. If you think of it if you don't think of it in economic or free market terms, but if you think of it in political terms, you run into nothing but paradoxes. And it seems to me that the fundamental paradox about globalization is that on a political level, what we see happening is the entire world, the entire human community is in some sense being networked, being grouped together. But of course it is not at all unified. There is no sense in which everybody on the world is the same. The reality is that people are very different, they don't agree, and it's not possible to get political agreement for different people. And because of that, I think the only way that the world can become unified in some sense is through technology. Technology is driving us towards a single, seamless humanity, but it's not possible to reach that by political means. And in fact, if anything, everything that counts as political, it represents a counterpoint to that. One of the definitions of politics that I've come to believe is very true is that politics is fundamentally, the way politics fundamentally achieves unity is by identifying a collective enemy. And while it always sounds very reductionist when you frame it that way, I think there is a disturbing amount of truth to it, so that the British really didn't discover they were British until the 14th century, when they discovered that they were the French people whom they really hated. And before that time, they'd all been Angles and Saxons and Normans, and they all hated each other. And so on down the line. I think that the reality of human nature is that people are unique, they're different, they're individuals, and because of that, it's not possible to achieve any kind of fictitious political unity around a positive good. It's only possible to achieve unity around negative goods, around collective enemies, external enemies, and things like that. Now, the paradox is that this could work in a tribal context. It was maybe not just, it was maybe wrong in a lot of ways, but it could sort of work in some kind of very narrow sense. It can never work in a global context, because when you're talking about the entire planet, there is no outside left. I'm assuming we're not going to have an invasion by aliens from outer space, because that's probably the one way you could achieve political unity. You could have peace on Earth by starting an interplanetary war. That's not an option. For one thing, I don't think the aliens will arrive in time to save us from ourselves. For another, I think that's basically that's not the reality that we're dealing with on some level. And so what you see instead is this very fundamental conflict. If you look at organizations like the United Nations that are designed to achieve some kind of world political system, people always say, well, they're so ineffective, they do so little. And I would say the reality is that no open global political organization can achieve anything when it's basically when it has to unite against outsiders, and on a global basis there are no outsiders. That's the fundamental paradox of the global economy. It is radically incompatible with politics. And that's why I believe that as technology progresses in the 21st century, and as we continue to see the globalization of the world economy, we will come to see government more and more as a reactionary force, as a force that is standing in the way of progress. And we will have to take a very drastic choice. I think the world, the current system is not stable, where we have this weird hybrid of trying to preserve political regimes in which people are defined by an us versus them, insider versus outsider mentality, with a global marketplace in which you're trying to figure out a way for everybody to be able to get along with everybody else on the planet. You can't have both. You have to choose between politics and between sort of the hidden motor of Western civilization, which in some sense is being driven most clearly by technology. That's a very fundamental choice. We know that the way of politics and government and things like that lies sort of murder and madness, and that's a sense in which government is something that's, I think, almost literally demonic in the world we're living in today. It's not an option. We must go the other way. I think most people are, I'll end on a very libertarian note. I don't believe that there's anything about this that is historically predestined in one way or another. I think it's up to individuals to choose which of the two they want, and I would encourage people to choose entrepreneurship, to choose innovation, to choose the global marketplace, and to choose the authentic vision that the new economy, I believe, encapsulated very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. At the Independent Institute's Conference Center in Oakland, we hold many events on different policy issues. Several years ago, before PayPal, Peter gave a talk with another economist, his name is Richard Rahn, on virtual money. And at that time, he had a firm called Confinity, which was merged, and that's part of what PayPal came from. But it's interesting going back and reading that transcript and what's happened since. Our next speaker is also a true pioneer, in his case, in communications. He's known and worked with many top business leaders. He joins us tonight to share with us his vision of the work and impact of our honoree this evening. Daniel Edelman is the founder and chairman of Daniel J. Edelman Incorporated, the highly respected, largest privately held, and sixth largest public relations company in the world. His firm has won 35 silver anvils awarded by the Public Relations Society of America for outstanding programs, and was selected in the year 2003 as Agency of the Year by both the Holmes Report and Inside PR magazine. Dan graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Columbia College and earned an MS degree from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. He's the recipient of Columbia University's Distinguished Alumnus Award and the John Jay Award. He is the 1992 Jewish United Fund of Chicago Communicator of the Year. The Arthur Page Society inducted him into the Hall of Fame in 1997, and he's received the Gold Anvil Award from the Public Relations Society of America, the highest award awarded in public relations. In 1999, he also received the first ever Outstanding Achievement Award from the China International Public Relations Association, and his awards just go on from there. I'm really pleased to introduce Dan Edelman.
Thank you. That sounded like I was going to make the speech, but that's going to be Bob. Thank you very much. Bob heard that I was going to make some remarks tonight, and he said, I want to talk to you about something very important to discuss with you. Will you please make it 1 minute? So my 1 minute's almost over, but I'll take advantage of Mr. Theroux's invitation to talk 5 or 10 minutes. It's really a pleasure for Ruth and me to celebrate the presentation of the Alexis Tocqueville Award to our good friend Bob Galvin, and especially when he's here with his bride Mary and quite a few of their family who also are here and I met earlier. Before I got to know Bob, I had the experience of meeting his father, Paul Galvin, the founder of Motorola. He headed up the Electronics Industry Association at the time, and we were invited to compete for the account of the trade association. We were competing with big firms. I went there alone. Our firm was very small. It had just been founded a couple, 3 years ago. Before that, I don't know how the heck we got on the list. And Mr. Galvin was sitting at the head of the table, and when I finished, he peppered me with a series of questions, and I really was perspired over that. I sweated it out, however, but we didn't win the account. The man was direct, no nonsense, and I know some of the further generations of the Galvin family are here. He's somebody you would have been very proud of. I'm sure that you didn't have an opportunity to get to know him. Maybe some of you did. But I would wonder where we all would have been if we didn't have the car radio that he created, which we had to use on our dates, and we used with pleasure. And also without his earlier product, which enabled you to plug the radio into the electricity and to have it work. We were using batteries before then. Bob is quite different from his father in many ways, but like him, he's extremely creative and a builder. He took Motorola from a few $100 million in annual sales to $27 billion, and was the first company into television, transistors, paging, cell phones, semiconductors, numerous other high-tech products, such as electronic engine controls, computer systems. He took the company worldwide in the 60s. I've been traveling throughout Asia for many years, and there was hardly a city that you'd get to that didn't have a big Motorola billboard at the airport or in a key location downtown. It was truly global. He's been engaged in every facet of public service, focused on alternative methods of systems of energy before that became a national issue, which it is certainly today. He has taken on many other important responsibilities, being one of the two saviors of the Illinois Institute of Technology, located in Chicago. More recently, Bob has been an author. You've heard about his book, America's Founding Secret, describing the Scottish Enlightenment, which Bob points to as the source of much of the knowledge absorbed by our founding fathers who created our democracy and market economy. And I'm sure Bob will be talking about that a little bit as he speaks tonight. I've heard Bob speak on many occasions at the Economic Club of Chicago dinner some years ago. I sat near him on the dais. I noticed he had a card with 10 bullet points on it, and he referred to that a little bit, but he spoke without notes, as I am, with notes. And I've heard him speak on the Scottish Enlightenment and on other subjects, and he, I'm sure, will tonight again. He said if I talk too long, he'll talk shorter, so we'll try to move along as fast as possible so that you get the benefit of his words. He's received dozens of awards from universities, business associations, industry, even the French Legion of Honor. It's so appropriate we'd honor him with the Alexis Tocqueville Award. The Tocqueville, when he came to the United States to write that famous book on democracy in America, was just 29 years old, an original thinker, pragmatist, who believed in individual freedom, and Bob reflects those wonderful characteristics. Bob and I, Ruth and I rather, had the privilege of being close to Bob and Mary Galvin for more than 40 years. Bob put it at 45 tonight when we were talking earlier. He was president of the Chicago chapter of YPO and engineered my nomination to succeed him. We've played tennis, and he's a fierce competitor, and I learned tonight that he sculls. In addition to playing tennis quite regularly, he does sculling, which I was reminded, I hadn't heard the term for some time, is in a boat, you're on your own, it's like rowing, and Mary does it too, and so they're both, Bob characterized her as being the only great-grandmother, probably, who's sculling regularly. We've joined Bob and his family on many evenings in connection with family celebrations, events at one of our homes, or civic dinners. And of course, most of you know, they're the parents and grandparents and great-grandparents of a lovely brood of Galvins, and many of them you can recognize from the Galvin look. For many years, we were owners of property at John Gardner's tennis ranch in Scottsdale, Ruth and me in a casita, and Bob and Mary and their children and grandchildren in a beautiful home on top of the hill. They fully deserve that because Mary literally discovered the place, and she and Bob convinced John Gardner to make Scottsdale his second tennis resort, a larger version of the one he was running in Carmel. Your honoree tonight is a man of great talents, wonderful character, and a humanist. He has excelled in business and in public service. He's warm, friendly, modest, and democratic. I'm pleased to join you in honoring him tonight, as Ruth is my good wife. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I know that there's quite a number of people in the audience who have also known Bob for many years and can testify in many other respects. The globalization of markets, as Peter was talking about, has certainly accelerated as we've witnessed a new revolution in technology, especially high technology. And our next speaker is one of its true pioneers. Dan has sketched a picture for us of a unique man, a man of integrity, a man of intellect, a man of vision, a man of enormous accomplishment. Perhaps some of this will come out in the Q&A period. A man of compassion, a man of great humility, as Dan mentioned. In the gift bags that you have, there's also a sheet in there, which is just sort of a snapshot of some of the comments we've gotten from people who couldn't join with us. And I'd just like to read a few of them. Quote, "I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be with you this evening to acknowledge in person the achievements of this very special man, Bob Galvin, a man of superb wisdom, presence, and character, whose words you listen to because they are true. Bob is a class act, and his presence raises the standard for corporate and institutional behavior for the rest of us. We are indeed grateful for all he has done for us and for our country. Thank you, Bob, and congratulations. Robert Eisenstein, President of the Santa Fe Institute. Quote, I've been a genuine fan of Bob Galvin and his associates in Motorola and his fellow members in the Young Presidents Organization, the Chief Executives Organization, and the Electronic Industries Association. He has combined a lifetime of managerial leadership, technical vision, government counsel, human relations, scholarship, faith-based living, along with being a very strong family man. Unquote, Roland Bixler, President and Treasurer, JBT Instruments. Quote, I consider Bob Galvin a friend and a great businessman and a great person. I've stated publicly in many speeches that Bob is the most visionary business leader I have ever met, unquote. Thomas Malone, President and CEO, Milliken & Company. In addition to his stunning successes leading Motorola, Bob has served as chairman of the board of trustees of the Illinois Institute of Technology that Dan was referring to, Santa Fe Institute. He was vice chairman of the Universities Research Association. Many of you may have seen the complete bio on our website that we put up and also sent to many people. It was far too long to put on the dinner program. He's a recipient of over 10 honorary degrees. Under his leadership, Motorola was the first company-wide winner of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. He's a member of the National Business Hall of Fame, and I should mention that Bob was also a founding member of YPO and CEO. But we honor tonight Bob for most of all because of how he has achieved his success. Through adherence to the highest of principles, dedication to helping others learn the meaning and importance of these ideas, his current work memorializing the origins and findings of the Scottish Enlightenment is reviving interest in a group of pioneering thinkers whose insights are, if anything, even more relevant today than they were when they were first written in the 1770s and afterward. Most recently, as you know, Bob is the author of this book. There's also a copy in your gift bag, entitled America's Founding Secrets on the Scottish Enlightenment. It's not the first book on the subject. It won't be the last. It's not an in-depth scientific or scholarly work, but it's a very important book because what Bob has done is he's essentially written a book which is sort of like an executive summary for people who are busy. How do you communicate to busy people the key insights of this group of people that have had such a profound influence on life in the United States and worldwide? Few of these people have the time to read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations or other works. So throughout his career, Bob has exemplified the term, quote, a scholar and a gentleman, end quote. And I'm honored and pleased to present to you Bob Galvin.
I come to events of this nature where there is bound to be stimulation, hoping to be ready to be responsive. Peter has given us, I think, a superb early presentation, which I thrilled to hearing of his entrepreneurial success and his philosophies. Adam Smith would have liked to have heard his speech on globalization. But Peter and I don't see eye to eye on how the world will evolve into the better place that it has to be. So let me give you a contrasting point of view. If you read my book, America's Founding Secret, How the Scottish Enlightenment Helped Our Founding Fathers, you will catch a hint of what I will now elect to speak of publicly for the first time. The Scots became a superb role model of building nation. The United States is a superb role model of nationhood. There has to be a determination, and there can be a high promise if others of us from this point forward will pick up the cue from the Scots, which I will hint at here in my verbal comments, and which, if you read the book, which is a very easy read and has some substantial facts and factors in it, you will see that I have written that there is a chance that if we will copy the modus operandi of the Scots, and with the great strengths that were accorded us as a function of the founding that followed them, that it would be possible to pick 2 or 4 nations in need of betterment and make them better as the Scots made themselves better and as we made ourselves better. Let me just pick up a couple of themes from the book and then see if I can make that point, to your levels of interest in the differences between how the two of us look at things. In the 1500s, the people of Scotland were in dire need. They were in need of hope. They were subject to lordly tyranny. And just 2 or 3 people in the country, I named them, Hector Boyce, John Moyer, and George Buchanan, said, we've got to change the quality of leadership in our country. The monarchs, the princes, the feudal lords, they're immoral, they're unprincipled, they're totally selfish. We must teach our leaders morals and manners. Imagine that, changing a whole country by just 2 or 3 people. And they started that, and over generation after generation after generation after generation, for 250 years, it was as if there was a force field with a unique internal magnetic strength that built more and more people among the learning Scots, not only the literary, who caused that there did accomplish in 1750 the brightest people ever assembled in one place at one time, who were the leading thinkers in all fields of knowledge. They had made Scotland into the superior institution intellectually in the world, which is not known by very many Americans. On other occasions, when I've talked to audiences, such as those that Dan spoke of, I've spoken to people at a number of other institutions. I've often asked the question, how many of you knew about the Scottish Enlightenment and what they did to build a nation? And there's only 2 or 3 people out of 100 that know about that. But here was a hopeless situation that built the quality of nationhood with all of the fibers of greatness. Now, it so happened that through a variety of processes that, again, are spoken of in the book, it was possible to transfer the wisdom of the Scottish Enlightenment to our founding fathers. How often, maybe you asked the question, as I did as I was a student of American history, how come we were so favored that there did emerge a group of people, just a couple of scores of them, who we call patriots to begin with and founders eventually, who all seemed to just come upon the scene, and they had courage and wisdom. There have to be first causes. What was the root of their wisdom? The root of their wisdom were those who were the Scottish Enlightenment. I'm not going to take an inordinate amount of time here this evening to paint that picture for you, but you know the names of James Watt and Adam Smith. You probably don't know too well about Francis Hutcheson and Hume and Lord Kames, Dougal Stewart, a whole slew of other men. These people had garnered as a collective group who were the ultimate generation that had this remarkable wisdom of being the best geologists, the best chemists, the best political thinkers, the best architects and engineers, who built a society that made Scotland a nation to be factored. It lost its independence, but it didn't mean that it hadn't shown the way to nationhood. All that they learned, they imparted to us, and it made possible what my father did in founding our modest company, what Peter has done in the achievements with his, and I know a number of others of you out in this audience who have done similarly. They did it because the principles, the roots, were established in this country. Learning from the Scots. The big lesson of the Scots was the lesson of the role of property, resources, in commercializing societies. That was the pivot point in the history of man when finally a group of wise people said, yes, we've had those who were in agriculture. Now it's time for commerce. And commerce is the basis of building societies. And incidentally, a good part of that commerce today is technology bent. But it was the role of property that they taught to our founding fathers, so that they in turn were the first to establish a country built on commerce, capital, and the creation of wealth through the employment of a subsystem in society called business. Many of you here are a part of that today's society of business. We would never have been the grand society we were if we had not had the roots imparted to us from the Scots, which is detailed in some useful way in this book, and I commend it to you. But we picked it up and carried it farther. We were nothing as a nation. Now, what did the Scots do, and what did we do that give hope that others can take the essences of our experiences, even the particular lessons from the Scots, and that is that there are things that one does that can make a stale nation into a vital nation. And the first thing is that you have to admit that what you're doing is wrong. There has to be somebody in the society who is willing to call out that challenge. And that cadre will be a minority. It was 3 in the case of Scotland. It was a couple of scores of patriots in our country. It could be any number in the 50 or 60 countries of the world that have to be brought into the real world so they can be a part of that global society that Peter and Adam Smith have talked about. So my message in relationship to the integration of the synthesizing of the things that can go on directly and subliminally in meetings of this nature is that there are ways of doing things better. The Scots, among other things, had a great ability to work together interdependently and interdisciplinary with regard to their affairs, and that was to have clubs. They had many clubs. The great scholars were members of 2 or 3 clubs. They'd meet probably almost once a week at their clubs. A dissertation was being made, a comment of one kind or another. Maybe they would just frolic on that particular meeting. I see the formation among private sector peoples in the current enlightened countries of the world, forming in a fashion like those of us in all manner of seminar class of activities, will be available to help flourish the enlightening that may take place in the next country that is ready to join the real civilized world with a strong commercial base, and yes, even a better legal system and a better governance system. We have to have them all. We have to have success in technology. But Peter, I am of a mind that having fostered technology around the world, that it will not be the seed from which all good will come. It's going to have to come from principles, such as are acknowledged in this text. And I hope, as a consequence of the fact that I'm going to pick up on this theme, and I have rewritten the theme now into a form of book. This is really a collection of essays. And I'm going to make a very strong appeal in that book for the fact that the great ultimate heritage of the Scottish Enlightenment, having taught Americans how to be Americans, is that we can sow the seeds of a commercial civilization, free, enlightened, objective, open-minded, that will do for the next generations, over the next 100 or 200 years, the emergence of a new class of civilization with all the economic opportunities that go with it. I'm very pleased to have the privilege of being with this august group of leaders and peoples and friends, and I am so pleased to again be associated with the Garvey family, many others of my friends from different institutions from around the country, who are all in very strong support of the thesis that is suggested by just the simple idiom that is pictured behind me. We have a great opportunity to take the next step, as Boyce, Moyer, and the others in Scotland, as our founding fathers did here, and to put in the hands of nations elsewhere the application of the principles that have brought us to the point of the great privileges that we are accorded here this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. We have some questions, and if those of you have questions, please use the question cards, and we can continue to circulate and pick up questions for both Bob and Peter. So I'd like to start with technology. There. Sorry about that. The first question is for Bob Galvin, and the question is, how do you bridge the technology divide between the haves and the have-nots using the Scottish model?
The Scottish model is built around enlightenment. Enlightenment is a way of thinking, free, open, objective, rational. And the first thing that we've got to do in terms of bridging is to have an ability to understand each other, language or otherwise. The Scots, incidentally, spent a lot of time on rhetoric to get things done. There has to be literacy for the technologies to be readily transferred. A generation earlier than Peter, colleagues of mine, some of whom are sitting in this room, took technology to the first order of receiving nations who could accept the technology. They are flourishing today. So there has to be an enlightenment with regard to education and literacy, so that those to whom we will carry our investments and our services can pick up and do what is clearly understandable, but you have to have the base to understand.
Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Peter?
No, all good.
The next question is, how can the lessons of the Scottish forefathers be applied to America today, particularly regarding globalization?
The theses of Adam Smith and David Hume in particular are as enlightened and applicable to today's thinking as they were in training people on an introductory basis of what those principles were back in the late 1700s. So, frankly, just studying the Scottish Enlightenment, studying what the Scots have done, there are incidentally a lot of marvelous books on the Scots of how they have taken their try-to and to-do philosophy and character and have gone about and have seeded great success throughout the world. So role models are there to be copied.
Next question is, how do you see the future, the present and future competitive position of the U.S. semiconductor companies?
You can pick up on any of these you want.
That would be your area of expertise. I'll take that one.
There are about 10 or 15 sage semiconductor leaders, executives, technologists in this audience. Maybe I am underestimating the number of outstanding people. I cannot imagine that the United States will ever be less than the equal of the best in the creation of the semiconductor recipes for product development throughout the world. Among the things that are represented in this room are those who had to do with the establishment of an organization called Semitech. Its distinguished leader is sitting among us, among others. And we taught ourselves in that organization how to get better at what we were doing rather well. The American spirit is such that it will always do things of that nature as well as individual and independent activities. I see America as being a continuing equal of the best, often moving ahead to the best. Thank goodness there is remarkable competition in 2 or 3 other nations of the world that will keep us on our toes.
The USA has to maintain leadership in the global economy. What is your take on outsourcing?
Well, I think that certainly the Adam Smith line that comes to mind is that no country has ever done well that basically was endowed with great harbors, and that chose to throw rocks in them and prevent people from importing and sending things to them. So, and very much the same thing I think that is true of free trade applies to the free movement of labor. You know, there are a lot of internal challenges with outsourcing. There are people who are going to be displaced, but the reality is that if you don't do it, it's much worse. If the U.S. is to remain competitive, we need to be able to outsource, and the U.S. needs to focus on doing things better in other ways, and needs to see this as a challenge for us to get better at doing things rather than an obstacle. You don't become better if you have great harbors by throwing rocks in them and preventing people from importing things. I think Smith was right about that.
I would coin a phrase. and that would be resourcing. That's different than the resources that are property-based things. The resourcing. The nature of the world is that whatever was the source today moves to a different location tomorrow. We used to have most of our industry in New England. It moved to the Midwest. It moved to the South. It was always dislocating to the location left behind. But then let me quickly turn the subject into one that was literally a part of what Peter was talking about, and that is, what do the governments do? Fortunately, we have a constitution. The Constitution is the main law of the land. And I respectfully suggest that what you are going to be learning of, you may know it, but what the world is going to be learning of, is that anything that one does to attempt to artificially control sourcing will prove to be unconstitutional. No state can pass any law that will stand with our Constitution that penalizes someone who does outsourcing. That's interfering with international relations. You can't do that under our Constitution. We aren't going to be able to do it in relation to other world laws either. It is unconstitutional to worry about it. It's going to happen. And that hasn't surfaced, but I respectfully suggest watch for it. That will become a very major player in finally settling things down and getting people to realize we got to do what Peter has talked about. We got to go out there and compete. And incidentally, one of the things that is occurring and will occur in a greater, with greater frequency is the bringing of jobs bringing of jobs into the United States from those institutions outside of the United States who have the resources to invest in our country and will come and put new peoples into work on new subjects. So this is going to balance itself out.
Yeah, some of you may have seen some of the news reports. It turns out that last year China on net outsourced more than any other country to India, which is an interesting statistic. The next question is, I understand that you were involved in trade negotiations that resulted in making the commercial internet feasible. Is this true? And if so, can you recount this saga?
That would have to be you, Peter. I wasn't.
I wasn't either, so.
Okay.
I think neither of us invented the internet.
In reference to the Scottish Enlightenment, how do you combine your spiritual practice with your professional practice?
The premise that the Scottish Enlightenment represents, in effect, almost a theology of some kind, and then our regular practice, I can't quite derive the genesis of the question, but I do acknowledge that in the course of the Scots becoming the very talented people that they became in that ultimate generation in around 1750, they got there as a function of having been viciously tested by the religious Reformation. The Calvinist thesis of predetermination was beginning to challenge men's ability to think. Every church in Scotland attempted to teach a greater fear of God, the wrath of God, than the other. And the fact of the matter is that the religious movement that took place in the period of time of roughly the 1600s, John Knox was living in the 1500s, but in the 1600s and the 1700s provided a stressful effervescence that made for a remarkable emergence of other intellectual as well as theological thinkings that made a difference. I haven't applied that to an individual, but it had a marked impact on causing that which was the Scottish Enlightenment was better than it would have been, than it could have possibly have been if it had not been stressed by the religious Reformation.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I would underscore is that while there are some definite differences between my perspective and Bob's, one thing that I very much agree with is that in the late 18th century, the Enlightenment direction was the only rational direction that people could possibly go in. You have to sort of, I think the historical context was one where in the early 17th century, you had seen Europe almost destroy itself in the wars of religion, and there had to be some sort of ability to try to take a step back from that and try to figure out some slightly different basis on which people could work together and get along. And so I think there was a historical context the preceding 100, 150 years that really, for the late 18th century, made the Enlightenment the only possible direction, at least for that point in time.
The next question is, Adam Smith critiqued government privileges and proposed the abolition of so-called mercantilism. Would you describe the U.S. today as neo-mercantilist? Or in that direction, I guess is what he's saying.
I really don't know. I know that what the private enterpriser is doing. I know what the Peters are doing. I know some of you who are in your businesses now. I know what we did and my colleagues that are continuing in our institution are doing. I think that we are not, in this instance, struggling with a philosophy. I think we're dealing with a very wonderful principle, and that is that commerce is the way to afford a free society. Then you have to have the structuring of and the ingraining of principles in that free society. And that what those who are engaged in commercialization have to realize is that their great contribution to society is to make affordable everything else in society. And we have to do that by playing to the whole market. We call it global, and we're learning how to do that. The Peters have learned a lot about it, and my colleagues in other of our tables in this room, we're learning about it. So I don't know what to call it, but I do know that it's very simple that we have to create wealth wherever we can honorably do it, and that wealth will ultimately end up being reasonably shared by those who have the literacy to participate with us in a civilized way.
Let's see. I basically agree with that. I think fundamentally, mercantilism does not make sense. At the same time, I think it's actually a close call politically in terms of what's happening. I think if you look at the electoral breakdown of people in the U.S. Congress, we probably have it's probably a slightly pro-protectionist bias. It's probably more protection than it has been at any time, I would guess, in about close to 20 years. So I think the case that Bob is making needs to be made a lot more forcefully than it has been.
Two last questions. This one's a little off the subject of the Enlightenment. This is a question for Peter. Please name and describe some of the stranger internet company ideas you've come across.
Oh my. Well, I don't want to. This would be sort of a long litany of things. I think one of the strange dynamics that happened culturally was that you basically had all these incredible new businesses that were being built in Silicon Valley, And elsewhere in the world, people were trying to copy Silicon Valley and do something similar. And what they copied was often not the entrepreneurial or the innovative piece, but the piece that was strange or different. And so you ended up in many places with companies that tried to simply copy the most bizarre features because they thought that was what was the defining piece of the new economy. So the strangest ones I actually ran into were outside the United States. There was one of the, the PayPal originally was combined with this company called X.com, which had branded itself around a single letter name. And there was a company I ran into in France, got about 100 million euros in funding, so it was a significantly funded company. And they decided to brand themselves to copy that and to use a single letter. They thought that was the most important thing. Nothing about the product or anything like that, just the single letter. And in Paris, and they called themselves Z-Bank. And so they used the letter Z. And everything was about doing a bank in a way that was different from the way it was normally done. The front page website had cartoon chimpanzees holding bags of money. It was meant to be a bank that did not take itself or your money too seriously. Indeed, the name itself was designed to basically make fun of French people. So it was about the bank, sort of make fun of pretentious French people, and so on down the line. And basically. And on every detail, they were going to do everything differently. So it was basically, there was a 35-hour maximum work week in France. Well, we will compete and we will attract people who do not want to work that long. So we're going to have a shorter work week than 35 hours. And so that was the mantra. And I think the takeaway, sort of on a higher level, is that when you look at businesses, one of the important questions is what kind of a role model you choose, and who is it that you want to copy, who is it that you want to emulate, and it's not just who you're emulating, but it's even on a somewhat more detailed level as to what exactly it is that one is emulating, and there's no probably categorical answer to that, but it's a fairly important question. At the tail end of the boom, it went very badly wrong, where people copied crazy things that other people were copying crazily from other people in turn, and it just sort of veered in really bizarre directions.
Okay, last question. Speaking of the French, the question is, please comment on the connection in thought between Frederick Bastiat and the Scottish Reformation. I assume he's talking about the Scottish Enlightenment, and I suspect this also relates to Say and other French liberal economists.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the beginning item that is supposed to be compared with the rest.
Please comment on the connection in thought between Frederick Bastiat and the Scottish Enlightenment.
I don't know what the factors were of the first, and therefore I am not credentialed to answer the question. I'm sorry, I can't, I don't understand the question, and therefore I can't comment. I'm sorry.
The Bastiat was a member of the French Parliament and was an economist who wrote various books. And there was a whole French classical liberal tradition. It's an interesting comparison because the English would not read the French. And so in many respects, they developed separately. And even to this day, most Americans aren't aware. In fact, most French are not aware of this tradition. I hope all of you will get a chance to read Bob's book because it is a quick read, as Bob mentioned. It's a book that I recommend anyone who is busy. But the reason why we're here is not just to talk about Bob's book. The reason we're here is because we greatly appreciate and admire Bob Galvin for a career that has been exemplary in every aspect of his life, which has been quite diverse. So Bob, all of us want to thank you sincerely for this work. And to express our gratitude, I want to take this opportunity to present you with an award the Independent Institute only gives occasionally. We've only given it to 4 other people over 18 years. As Dan Edelman mentioned, it's named after the 19th century classical liberal Alexis de Tocqueville. In your gift bag, you'll find a one-page sheet description of de Tocqueville and his work. And as Dan Edelman mentioned, de Tocqueville is the author of perhaps the greatest book ever written on liberty, called Democracy in America. Hence, in deep appreciation and recognition of your outstanding global contributions in advancing business excellence, free market entrepreneurship, education, moral principles, economic and social welfare, and your unwavering dedication to the principles of individual liberty as the foundations of free and humane societies, we proudly present to you the Alexis de Tocqueville Award.